I think it's very useful if students who are being introduced to cognitive psychology don't start learning about the history of cognition as a big celebration or triumph or victory over other less dominant approaches. Because I think Skinner makes a lot of good points in his argument in this article. Here's a summary of the entire article, the entire argument. The point is, according to Skinner, the variables that determine human behavior, those variables, are in the environment. And the broader context that Skinner uses, and this is something that he fleshes out more explicitly in another paper published in 1984, I believe. The title of that article is Selection by Consequence. But here he also touches on it in passing. There are three kinds of variables. One, those variables that determine who survives, what kinds of organisms end up surviving. Those factors, a lot of them are in the environment. So this is a discussion of phylogenetic attributes that stay as features of a species. Second kind of variables are those that determine what an organism can do. So there are certain things because of our environment that we cannot do and other things that we can do. If I live somewhere that has windows, I can look out of the window. If I am in a cell that has no windows, then I cannot. So a general form of that is that there are available actions, available behaviors because of our environments. And three, there are variables that determine what you actually do. The first kind determines the survival of species that are capable of certain behaviors, and those factors are in the environment. Second are available actions, and third one is through the lifetime of the organism. There are factors in the environment that determine what we actually do, and this third set of variables are what Skinner refers to as contingencies of reinforcement. But they belong to a broader perspective that includes all these three variables. For example, think about human babies crying. Imagine that there were a lot of babies who did not cry after being born, and they failed to get the attention of their parents because of that, and they didn't survive. Babies who did cry survived. And then imagine, so that's the phylogeny. Then imagine that the baby cries in the baby's lifetime, and every time the baby cries, it gets the attention of the parent. And the baby learns that, oh, whenever I cry, somebody attends to me. First of all, the act of crying is available and getting the attention because of the attentiveness of the parents. The act of getting attention becomes available, becomes a thing that the baby can do by virtue of being in that environment. And then he can use it for maybe more specific purposes later on, like crying in order to attain a toy. So one point here that we can emphasize, is that when we do something and it achieves a goal, that goal then becomes, the outcome of the action becomes integrated into the action itself. So it's not just crying. If crying consistently and reliably gets the attention of the parents, then the baby is getting the attention of the parents by the act of crying, because the outcome is now part of the act of crying. The goal is the attention. The goal is not to cry. I'm going to put the perspective of cognitive psychology side by side, and there are a lot of slides here that it is Skinner's perspective versus cognitive psychology perspective. Okay, here we have Skinner's description. It says that cognitive psychologists deal with the interaction between environment and person, but they don't deal with their relationship directly. What does this mean? We are going to go through three examples: example of a dog, example of lemon, and example of language. Let's remember Pavlov's dog. Pavlov's dog hears a bell, gets food at the same time, and then after a few exposures to this pairing, then starts salivating just after hearing a bell. So cognitive psychologists might say that in the mind of the dog, bell is associated with food. Here, cognitive psychologists posit something that exists in the mind of the dog. Skinner points out. And they say the dog in his mind associates the bell and food. But the fact is that the dog's mind didn't associate those two things. Pavlov did. The experimenter associated the bell and the dog. Those things are associated in the environment. And the dog detected that association. The dog learned something about the environment. Next example has to do with the experience of lemon. You and I can experience this. So when you see a lemon, it's possible to recall the taste vividly, the taste of the lemon. Vivid is an adjective that is used for describing visual imagery. I don't think it applies to, I don't think we can say vivid taste, but let's say realistic sense of taste. And if you taste lemon juice, the sourness of the lemon juice, we might remember the image of a lemon or the color yellow. And so the cognitive psychologist might say that in our minds, the image of lemon is associated with the taste of the lemon. Those two things are associated in our mind. Skinner says no, the two are not associated in our mind. They are associated in the world. Our mind learns this association and then expects one of the sensations after seeing the other. So there are like these bundles that exist in the world, and our sense organs or our perceptual systems respond. Our perceptual systems respond, and those responses also turn into a bundle as well, corresponding to the bundles in the environment. And because the sensory or perceptual responses bundle get associated with each other, then that turns into something akin to an expectation. Think about language next. So these words are associated. When in a word association task, you are given house, you might say home. Or when you're given the word hospital and asked to say the first words that come to your mind, you might say nurse or doctor or patient. Cognitive psychologists might say in your mind these words are associated. Skinner says the words are associated in the world, first of all and primarily. What do we mean when we say the words are associated in the world? We say in our conversations, in books, and in our descriptions of environments. So in summary, it is the world that has those associations. And here's the next point. Even if mental associations are really there in our mind, we do not need them to explain anything. Just by talking about the regularities of the environment, we already have an explanation. There's nothing extra that comes with referring to the mind, the content of the mind. Now, here at this point, Skinner moves to a discussion of some experiments with pigeons. And in our description of human behavior and human language, we have this concept of abstraction. We say that we abstract. We look at three things and we say they are all squares. Or we look at multiple objects and we say they're all red. He says that we can train pigeons to do something that looks like abstraction. We can train this pigeon to press one of these two available buttons. Imagine there's a white button there and there's a black button that the pigeon can peck. Imagine that we teach the pigeon that it will be rewarded if every time there is a red shape, anything red, regardless of the shape. If there's a red object and the pigeon pecks on the white button, the pigeon will get rewarded. So we make the reward contingent on two things, that the pigeon is seeing red, or not seeing red, it's faced with a red object and pecks on one of the two buttons, namely the white one. Pigeon learns to do this. Pigeon learns to press on a button every time there's a red object in front of it. In a sense, we can describe the pigeon's behavior as abstracting the color and ignoring the rest of the object. And Skinner argues that this is how human children learn to apply labels to the objects they see. They get a reward when they get an object name correctly. Then we get into the discussion of concepts that I didn't find very clear in Skinner's argument. But let's go through it. Cognitive psychologists, when they think about how we label things. They say we call white things white because all things that are white share a common feature, and that feature is whiteness. And it is that whiteness, the concept whiteness, that we are referring to. Skinner says we call white things white because we have learned to behave, to give this verbal response, the labeling response in the presence of when we face a certain type of object. So the concept whiteness cannot be dissociated from that act of calling something white. It's not something that exists in separation. Cognitive psychologists talk about the concept of white. Skinner says that evoking this concept is not necessary. We have behavior, we have the behavior of naming things, labeling things, and some objects invite that behavior. There are environments that when we are in those environments and we give these labels in those environments to those objects, that is the correct thing to do. Think, for example, about ice cream. Is ice cream a concept that is shared among all the objects we call ice creams? Or is it part of a structure of reward that we learn, that ice cream cannot be dissociated away, taken out of the context of activities, our activity of enjoying ice cream, buying ice cream, tasting ice cream? And it's structure of reward that we experience, and we derive the concept, so-called concept of ice cream. This structure of reward is what Skinner refers to by reinforcement contingencies. What is Skinner talking about? Why doesn't he like concepts? What he's talking about is that our arguments having explanatory power. He says that concepts don't give us any additional explanatory power aside from just learning about the structure of rewards. So let me read this. What explains the behavior of ice cream eating? Knowing the concept or knowing the reinforcement contingencies? To know whether or not a person will go and buy an ice cream. What do we need to know? Do we need to know that he understands the concept, or do we need to know about his history with ice creams and whether or not he has felt rewarded or whether or not he has enjoyed in the past? Or in other words, do we need to know his behavior and his history of reward in the past, or do we need to know about some kind of concept? And if we know about his history, does it give us any additional ability to explain his behavior if we continue and talk about this concept stuff? His other examples include sexual identity. He says cognitive psychologists say children learn the concepts boy and girl. Skinner says no, children learn to behave like boys and girls after they observe others. The example of crime. Cognitive psychologists might say people become criminal because of frustration, which is an internal factor, something that exists in the mind of the person who commits a crime. And Skinner says, no, people become criminal because of unemployment or because of bad economy. And what are these features? These features exist in the environment. We don't have to say anything about what is inside the mind. Then there are like devil's advocacy that Skinner considers some people who might disagree with him. Some special cases in which it might seem necessary that there must be something going on in the mind of the person who's acting. And the example is a conductor of an orchestra. Skinner says cognitive psychologists here might object to me and say, okay, somebody like a conductor surely maintains a rhythm, and he or she maintains a rhythm according to an internal sense of time, an internal beat. Skinner says, no. Conductor maintains the behavior of keeping a rhythm. Wait a second. You might say, I can keep rhythm. For example, I can keep counting in my mind or keep a rhythm without anybody noticing. It doesn't have to be something that I'm doing and other people noticing it, I can just do it secretly. How can Skinner explain this? Skinner says what you do when you count is not necessarily internal in the sense that inside the mind. It is a type of action. It is covert action. It's something that we have learned based on things that we have done overtly, and it's a relatively more covert version of a behavior that we have learned to do outside first. And we are still doing something. And that is a sign, the sign of that, evidence of that is that if we don't continue the act of counting, then we lose that beat. We will lose the rhythm. Thinking quietly is a form of action. Indeed, thinking quietly is a form of action is still a popular view in many regions in psychology, including, for example, discursive psychology, which says thinking is a covert and private form of conversation, and we can't learn to do it unless we have first learned to behave in conversations. Seems like a valid point. Thinking quietly, according to Skinner, is something we learn to do after we learn to talk to other people, talk overtly. Thinking is a private form of talking. It is a private action, but it is an action. So this is here you might think about Lev Vygotsky, who had the same idea. There is something else that Skinner is talking about. What is that? So according to Skinner, the way cognitive psychologists describe, there's an imprecision about that. You ask a cognitive psychologist, why did Jim eat the ice cream? And he or she says, he felt like it. What does that mean? It's not very clear. This is the imprecision that Skinner is talking about. Or he believed it tastes good. Belief again. What is that? But what if you say, because of the environmental contingencies, because there's a consistency, reliability, regularity in the way reward is associated with the action or behavior of eating ice cream. Now, that is something that is concrete. People know what you're talking about when you use that style of description. What will Jack do when he sees the ice cream? To predict this, to answer this question, what do you need to know? Do you need to know something about the mind, about the belief, feelings, or the previous behavior or history of reward? On the fifth page, Skinner says all operant behavior is goal-directed behavior based on previous contingencies of reinforcement. So all operant behavior go into the future, even though the causes of the behavior responsible for them happened in the past. The reason why, what causes our behavior is a history, is our previous rewards and punishments. So even though our behavior is forward-looking, the causes of this forward-looking process is something that happened in the past, our previous rewards. Common sense and cognitive psychology both want to explain behavior by talking about now. Like now, Jim believes that the ice cream is tasty. Now he wants to do it. Now he feels like it. Behaviorism talks about the past, the history of reinforcement, because that is where explanation lies. Here's a metaphysical disadvantage of cognitive psychology, Skinner says. Skinner says that cognitive psychologists end up with an awkward approach to reality in general. They say when you look at the world and you perceive the world, that what you see is not the external world. What you see is an internal model of the world. You don't see an apple or a cup of coffee or the desk or the students. You don't see them. What you see is something in your mind, the internal model that based on objects outside, the mind constructs for you to see. So see, there's this little guy, the homunculus, inside your head watching the models. This is you. So cognitive psychology ends up calling this homunculus, this little guy inside, calls that you. You are that. The body responds to the world and at the point of contact. So there's a point of contact between you and the world. When you reach for a cup of coffee, that point of contact between, it's the space in the environment. It's between our body and objects. That's where the interaction happens. Interaction with the world does not require making copies. Making copies would be a waste of time. So what is knowledge? which is a key term in cognitive psychology. And cognitive psychologists contrast knowledge in perception, and they talk they talk about it, independence or separation or relative separation of perception and knowledge. For example, knowing Chinese or German. Does this depend on, for example, having an internal dictionary, an internal lexicon? Does it involve storage of language-related knowledge? Examples also include knowing how to play chess or internal representation of rules. Does it involve somewhere in the mind where the rules are stored, like a hard disk? So on page 8, Skinner actually admits that rules pose a serious problem for behaviorism. He says, rules are created when we learn. So this is how she's talking about how he deals with the problem of rules, how his behaviorism explains our capacity to follow rules. He says rules are created when we learn from other people's mistakes. So we learn somebody else, or we hear about a scenario where somebody crosses the street with a red traffic light and gets a ticket or gets into an accident. And through that, we vicariously learn about the contingencies of reinforcement and punishment. And that learning allows us to follow this rule. But it's not essentially different from learning to enjoy ice cream. Rules are a serious problem for Skinner. And now I'm going to sidestep and make a footnote here and distinguish two rules. This is I took from John Searle, I think one of the people who clearly stated the difference between two kinds of rules. Regulatory rules or regulation rules and constitutive rules. What are these two? Regulation rules, regulatory rules include, for example, traffic rules. Why? Because the activity of driving a car can exist without the rules of traffic. Fighting rules in, for example, boxing. People fight. People are capable of fighting. They can engage in beating each other without the imposition of rules. And rules come later on in addition to solve certain problems or set up certain conditions. But driving and hitting others, boxing others, can go on without the presence of rules. And in these situations, we call these kinds of rules, regulation rules. By contrast to regulatory rules, we have constitutive rules. And these are rules that constitute the activity, which is to say that the activity cannot exist unless we have the rules. It's not that we play chess first and then we learn about the rules. Learning about the rules of chess enables us to start playing chess. Same goes for baseball and same goes for language. When I talked about language, a student asked me, but people don't need to, what did he say? Oh, I think he challenged, if I remember correctly, he challenged the idea that language relies on constitutive rules. He said that it relies on regulation. It has regulation rules because people speak already and then we come up with the rules of language and then we tell each other the rules of language. That is an interesting point. It was an interesting question. And I believe the answer to the question is that from the point of view of a second language speaker, somebody who is as an adult or as an outsider to a language, begins to learn a language, then they have to face the rules of language as rules of regulation. But natural language learning, learning a language as a native language, as one's native language, I believe involves learning constitutive rules. So following rules at the same time as emerging into society and a community as a user of a language. But rules are, so in this sense, rules are a problem for Skinner. Rules seem internal. Knowing, for example, the rules of chess, those rules seem internal and they don't seem to come from the environment. You might say children talk because they have an internal language capacity. But Skinner takes issue with this. takes issue with this kind of explanation. He says that saying that evoking a language capacity is like saying aspirin takes away pain because it has a painkiller ingredient. This is not an explanation. It's just using word magic. At the end of the lecture, I ended this lecture by talking about two responses to behaviorism. I won't go through these in detail. One is John Searle's Chinese room argument. The other one is based on Skinner and Forster's findings published in a huge book, Schedules of Reinforcement. The Chinese room argument basically is it can be used as a critique of behaviorism, which is to say it highlights the importance of paying attention to what goes on inside the internal mechanism or internal functions, what enables the behavior and not just the behavior itself. To say that somebody appears to be capable of speaking Chinese or appears to be speaking Chinese is not the same as the claim somebody speaks or understands Chinese. The question is, does the man inside the room understand Chinese? And this thought experiment is designed to compel us to say no. How about the Skinner and Forster? Based on the findings published in the Schedules of Reinforcement, based on these findings, we can divide the pattern of response by an organism into two general categories. One is steady state. A steady state is when the rate of responses, graphed here, the rate of responses are following a steady pattern. For example, 3 responses every 5 seconds. In contrast to that, we have these transition periods where the rate of response is chaotic, is too high, and not stable. When the contingencies of reinforcement in the experimental setup is predicted by the pigeon or by the rat, by the dog, when the contingencies of reinforcement are predicted, the organism reaches steady state. But when the contingencies of reinforcement become unpredictable, the animal's rate of response goes high, unusually high sometimes, but for a short period of time until again it reaches a new steady state after the schedule of reinforcement becomes predictable again. So explaining the fast responses, frequent responses to change, it seems reasonable to evoke two kinds of motives. One motive is the motive to reward, to get the food. The other one is the motive to know about the contingency, knowing, for example, that every 3 times you press a button, you get a reward. Not knowing that makes the organism uncertain about the mechanisms for getting the reward, which might produce anxiety. So these two needs, when we distinguish between the need to know, the need to be in control, the need to be able to predict as separate from the need for the reward itself, then we must evoke some concept that is more in line with the cognitive psychology approach.